Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome back to Mr. Mahmoud Helmi channel. Today, inshallah, we will have a new session with A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, and we will have and study chapter 1. The title of chapter 1 is The Mysterious Message. Time 1775, 18th century, place Dover, England. London and Paris, the capitals of the two countries, were uneasy as their revolutions drew near. Let's start with the summary of the chapter. The same poor conditions in the two cities. It was the year 1775, and conditions in both France and England were very bad. King George III of England was too busy handling his country's problems with American colonies to worry about his own people who lived in poverty. King Louis XVI of France and the noblemen were more concerned with their pleasure and wealth to worry about the poor, hungry lower classes. The poor people of France had begun to make plans to overthrow their rulers. So it was that London and Paris, the capitals of the two countries, were on the brink of revolution, or in other words, were on the edge of revolution. The Dover Mail. There was much crime in England during this period. Thus, the passengers traveling out of London on late night in November feared for their safety when they heard a horse coming from behind. The rider had a message for one of the passengers heading for Dover, Mr. Lorry. Mr. Lorry is one of the main characters in the story. Mr. Lorry from Tellson's Bank in London, and he was a sincere friend to Dr. Manette, also one of the main characters of the story. The message said, "Wait at Dover for Mademoiselle." Mr. Lorry answered, "Jury, you can't say that my answer is recalled to life." Mr. Lorry then began to doze, began to sleep, but his sleep was not restful, for his dreams were filled with scenes of him digging a man out of a grave. Over and over, Mr. Lorry asked the ghost, "How long have you been buried?" "Almost 18 years, was the ghost's repeated reply. By mid-morning, the mail coach arrived in Dover, the departure point for boats crossing the English Channel to Calais, France. Mr. Lorry arranged for a room at the Royal George Inn. Then he asked for another room to be prepared for a young lady. Another subtitle for that chapter, Recalled to Life. Miss Manette, here we mean Lucy Manette, the daughter of Dr. Manette. Miss Manette arrived from London. She was very anxious to see the gentleman from Tellson's Bank at once. Miss Manette was a young lady of not more than 17, dressed in a riding coat with her hat in hand. She was short, slim, pretty girl with long golden hair and deep blue eyes. The look of the girl made Mr. Lorry remember her as a child when he held her in his arms during a passage from France to England 15 years before, but Lucy Manette did not recognize him at first. The young lady told Mr. Lorry that she received a letter from Tellson's bank informing her about a discovery regarding some property of her father, who had been dead for so long. The property was in France. The letter said that she must go to Paris to meet a gentleman from the bank. She replied to the bank asking to be put during that journey under the protection of that gentleman. The gentleman had already left London, so a message was sent after him to wait for her at Dover. Mr. Lorry told her that he was the man from Tellson's bank. Then he told her the story of a French customer of the bank. He was a doctor of a great talents who was married to an English lady about 20 years ago. Mr. Lorry was a friend of that man and served him in the bank. One day, the doctor had suddenly disappeared. His wife feared that he might have been sent to prison by a powerful enemy who could sign some papers to imprison any person for as long as the enemy wished. And that's what happened to Dr. Manette. A powerful enemy put him in prison for a crime that he didn't do. The mother begged the people in authority to know anything about her husband, but failed. She decided, after she lost hope to find her husband, she decided at last to raise the child to believe that her father was dead. The mother then died broken-hearted when the child was only 2 years old. Then the child had been moved to England by Mr. Lorry. The father had been found alive, but changed so much that no one would recognize him. He had been freed from the Bastille prison and taken to the house of his old faithful servant in Paris. Mr. Lorry told her that they were going there. Mr. Lorry to identify him and Lucy to comfort him and restore him to health. Mr. Lorry also warned her that her father had been found under another name and that the people who had put her father in prison still ruled the country, so they mustn't speak of that matter or carry papers referring to it. They simply used the code words recalled to life to refer to Alexander Manette's release from prison. The young lady, trembling violently, said, "I'm going to see his ghost. It will be his ghost, not him." Then she fainted. A wild-looking woman with red hair rushed in and grabbed Mr. Lorry's jacket. She lifted him from his chair and sent him flying across the room. She was so angry with him for frightening Lucy to death. She was Miss Bruce, who had taken care of Lucy since her childhood. Commentary. This is the last commentary about the chapter. The Dover Mail, it's a mail coach that carried letters from London to Dover and the vice versa. The Dover Mail took letters and passengers to the Dover port, where they crossed the English Channel to Calais, the port on the opposite side in France. Here is a picture about the chapter. Jerry, you can say that my answer is recalled to life. Now, let's go directly to questions and answers about the chapter. Question number 1. And I want to tell you that we have two kinds of questions related to that chapter. We have WH questions and we have quotation. And the quotation is we just take a quotation from the textbook and you have to write your comment and discussion about that quotation. Number 1. Speak about the gap between the high and the low classes in the two countries. As I told you before in the introduction that there was a very big gap between the lives of the rich people, noblemen, and the peasants and poor people. There were huge differences and gaps between people at the time. The nobles were living in comfort and luxury, whereas the peasants and common people were living in poverty and misery. Number 2, why were the poor in very bad conditions in France and England? The King of England was too busy with problems with the American colonies to worry about his own people who lived in poverty. The King of France and his noblemen were more concerned with their pleasure and wealth to worry about the poor, hungry, lower classes. Number 3, why did the passengers fear for their safety when they heard the horse coming behind them? Because there was much crime in England during this period and roads were unsafe and full of thieves. Question number 4, what did the rider want? The rider wanted to speak to one of the passengers, a man called Mr. Lorry. He had a message for him. 5, why was the message that the rider carried? What was the message that the rider carried? What was the reply? The rider carried a message to Mr. Lorry to wait at Dover for Miss Manette. Mr. Lorry's reply was recalled to life. That's the code name that was given to Dr. Manette, so as not to mention his real name. Why didn't Lucy's mother want her to know that her father could be alive? Lucy's mother didn't want her to know that her father could be still alive because she spent 2 years looking for him, but couldn't find out whether he was still alive or dead. She wanted her daughter to grow up happily without doubts and worries. And that's, of course, after she lost hope to find her husband. Recalled to life. This is the kind of question that I told you. It's a kind of quotation from the textbook, and you have to write your comment and discussion about that kind of question. Recall to life. Comment. That was Mr. Lorry's reply to the bank's message. It meant that Dr. Manette, who was believed to be dead for so long, was found alive. He would be recalled to life by the help of Mr. Lorry and Lucy Manette. Wait at Dover for Mademoiselle. Comment. Yes, Mademoiselle here, we mean Lucy, Miss Lucy Manette. This was the message that horse rider carried for Mr. Lorry. The message asked Mr. Lorry to wait at Dover for Miss Manette to accompany her to Paris as she was afraid to travel alone. Number 9. Why was Mr. Lorry not restful in his sleep? because his dreams were filled with scenes of him digging a man out of a grave. I'm going to see his ghost. It will be his ghost, not him. Comment. This is the quotation from the text. Of course, these words were said by Lucy Manette about her father. Lucy Manette said this to Mr. Lorry. She had been told that her father, whom she had thought dead all her life, was still alive. He had been in prison for 18 years and was now free. Mr. Lorry had warned her that he was greatly changed and lost his mind. Jury, you can say that my answer is recall to life. Who said this to whom? Mr. Lorry said this to the horse rider. Who is meant by recall to life? Dr. Manette. What did the words recall to life mean? Mr. Lorry wanted to assure the bank that his mission to restore Dr. Manette to London was going to be fulfilled successfully. Question number 12. What strange dream did Mr. Lorry have? What did it mean? In his sleep, Mr. Lorry dreamed that he was digging a man out of a grave and asking him how long he had been buried. The man answered that he was buried for almost 18 years. This was a reflection of Mr. Lorry's mission of recalling Dr. Manette to life after his long imprisonment. Describe Miss Manette or Lucy Manette. She was a young lady of not more than 17. She was short, slim, pretty girl with long golden hair and deep blue eyes. Question number 14. What secret did Mr. Lorry finally reveal to Miss Manette? Of course, the secret about her father. Mr. Lorry told her that her father wasn't dead, as she had always believed. He had been found alive in Paris. He had been imprisoned in a French prison, and that prison was the Bastille, for the past 18 years, and that she would accompany him to Paris in a secret mission to bring her father back to London. Question 15. It's a story you know because it was you who brought me to England when my mother died, just 2 years after my father's death. Comment. Who said these words? Of course, these words were said by Lucy Manette. Lucy Manette said this to Mr. Lorry when she realized from his story that he was talking about her dead father. She remembered she had seen Mr. Lorry before. He was the person who carried her from Paris to London 15 years ago after her mother's death. Question 16. The story Lucy Manette knew about her father was different from the story Mr. Lorry explained. Lucy believed that her father had died before she was even born, but he had been sent away to prison by a powerful enemy who could sign some papers imprisoning him for as long as the enemy wished. Question 17, I think this is the last question of that chapter. Why couldn't you tell her what you had to without frightening her to death? Comment. Of course, these words were said by Miss Pross, okay, the house manager of Lucy Manette, Miss Pross, the woman who had taken care of Lucy since childhood, said this to Mr. Lorry. Miss Pross attacked Mr. Lorry violently and shouted those words at him when Lucy had fainted after knowing the truth from him. She shouted at him, "Why couldn't you tell her what you had to without frightening her to death?" And this is the end of the chapter, and this was the last question of that. I want you to read these extra questions, think about them, and try to find answers for them while after reading and uh, analyzing the questions and answer of chapter 1. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being with me. Till we meet again in chapter 2, I wish you the best of luck. Thank you. Don't forget to put like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.